At this time, I want to let Andres share his thoughts on the day with us before we depart.
Well, a couple of, there are really two conferences. There's the one that's here, that's occurring before you, which it basically takes care of itself. You know, we have wonderful speakers and they're very clear. And then there's a second conference of conversations that take place elsewhere and questions that I'm asked. And I often put off. I say, well, instead of spending the energy to answer, it's a good question, instead of answering it individually, let's just put it to later. So there's a second conference of good questions, and there are a few that were brought up. First, I'd like to actually take seriously the pedestrianization of Lincoln Road and the pedestrianization of many places that is currently emerging. I mentioned earlier that about in the pursuit of emulating the shopping malls, that about over 200 main streets were pedestrianized in the United States, and I've heard even higher numbers than that. I've also heard that only 2 or 3 survived, and because they died, and they died very, very quickly. And they got a very bad name, and it was an article of faith by the new urbanists that actually pedestrianization does not work. It simply doesn't work. It's one of the things we knew, that cars add energy. But since we are, in fact, observers of success, and because also times change, I think it must be brought to the fore that actually there's more than one, there's 3 that I know, that actually are moving forward as being, they were never opened, but they became successful. And one of them is Lincoln Road, and there's several things that caused it to work. One is Lincoln Road is very, very long, but it began as one place, highly concentrated. You know, it was one block. It actually was one shop, and then another restaurant across the way, and then a third. And then one block became very well known, and by the time it was 2 blocks, it was famous. And actually every 5 years, maybe every 3 years, it goes one more block in a very, very astoundingly systematic way. It moves east 1 block at a time every 3 years. And it's the same way that Charleston moves north, and Havana moves in 3 or 4 directions. So one of the reasons that happened is that it came under single management. Okay, one of the things that changed it is that actually 3 or 4 or 5, I don't know how many developers, got together, literally, like Tony Goldman assigned and said, you buy this block, or these, you know, you buy the majority of the shops in this block face, you buy the majority of the blocks of the shops in this block face, etc., and then we will actually move forward together. So when I renovate, yours will be renovated, and the third will be renovated, and we create a predictable environment for ourselves. I know that I won't be standing alone. I know that there'll be a coffee shop there, and a magazine shop there, and a jeans store here, and a restaurant there. And this happened also in the Deco district. It's currently happening in Miami in Wynwood, in which one developer organizes the rest. This aspect of centralized management comes in from the suburbs. It's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the hybrid of traditional urbanism but suburban management. And one of the things that is also organized is that the parking in the B street behind it gets organized. Remember I spoke about A streets that are first rate? Lincoln Road and Colorado Avenue in Pasadena, and the 3rd Street or 4th Street Promenade in Santa Monica are inviolate. There are no gaps in the main street, but behind it is a very clear B or C street, continually gapped by parking lots, parking garages, dumpsters, etc. And so that requires that retrofit of A, B, A, B, A, B, which actually creates a city that can accommodate cars while still having pedestrians. Right? Not only do we have dumpsters, we have parking garages, we have trucks that need to maintain the ever larger electrical infrastructure, we have blank walls, we have drive-throughs. There's a lot of bad stuff. What confuses us is that planners have always allocated things. They've always said, the factories don't go here, they go there. Okay, and when we did that, as I may have mentioned earlier, I forget, people got very, very healthy because we took the pollution away. What the planners have forgotten is that we no longer pollute. We do not make factories that kill you. We don't make, because the people who work inside the factories, adjacent to the stuff, in fact, it has to be healthy. But we have this idea that we have to separate everything from everything else still. You know, what Don Shoup spoke about, the mania of zonings, the mania that you have 30, 40, 50, 60 zoning categories, is this ridiculous attempt to relive this great success. Oh, we separated the factories from the dwellings. Well, that went well. We got famous. People loved us. Let's separate everything from everything else. And every generation ever more micromanages the separation, and every generation contributes to planning by actually having ridiculously different parking requirements. And that comes from that, a sickness, it's an infection from that great success of separating. But we still have to separate things. You know the only noxious uses we have? The noxious uses that remain are the automobile-related ones. What kills and damages our streets are the lousy frontages, the blank walls, the parking garages, you know, the great big malls that let trucks in and out. All of these things are, and we have to completely recalibrate about what we need to separate from everything else. We do not need to separate shops from each other. We rarely need to separate anything. In fact, the more we put together, the better things work. Hotels anchor shops, shops anchor housing, housing anchors offices. Everything anchors everything else. We have gradually reassembled the cities that the idiot planners have disassembled for the last 30 years by separating offices from here, etc. So we have, what the new urbanists have done is gradually, one step at a time, reassemble the city of all the elements that in the codes are separated, because we now realize that everything anchors everything else. But what remains as a problem is the noxious use of parking. So what the new urbanists do is we sort of laser and separate the A, B, and C frontages. The only thing that matters in a city is the frontage. What is the frontage? The frontage is how the building meets the sidewalk. How the building meets the sidewalk. If I had to write a very, very lean code, and they said, Andres, what would you like to code? I said, I only need to code one thing, how the building meets the sidewalk. If I can code that, I can code where the shops are. I can code decent housing on the first floor. I can code more urban and rural conditions with yards. And what happens above doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the frontage, really. And we should actually try to just do a frontage code. This is so true that once I asked Bob Gibbs, my retail advisor, I said, why don't shopping malls have things like post offices and things like travel agencies and so forth? And he told me, he says, because it's too boring to walk by them. And I said, what, a post office? I said, yeah. Americans are so piano wire tense about being continually amused. We need to be amused so continually that 30 feet of something as boring as travel posters say, oh, time to go home, and the shop on the other side dies. So what's the fault? The fault is ourselves. Now, by the way, whenever you see these rules being broken, which you sometimes do, it's only in two cases. One is where there are students, and they put up with a lot of rough treatment. You know, the students actually will have caused pedestrian malls to survive. The students will cross streets that are uncrossable by anybody else. They'll put up with it. And of course, there are the immigrants. And I remember Ellen Dunham Jones about 10 years ago actually making the case that those suburban shopping centers that were, 15 years ago, the new urbanists were actually very worried about the decay of the first generation, what we call the inner ring suburbs, not the inner city suburbs, which are good quality 1920s and 30s, but the 1950s and 60s suburbs were taking a dive in value, and the first string shopping centers. And Ellen reported that actually our immigrants, our Vietnamese immigrants, our mountain immigrants from countries we never heard of, we're actually reviving them. They were putting in their restaurants and their churches. And lo and behold, they were actually walking on very rough frontages. But they're not Americans yet. They're very accustomed to actually roughing it. to actually walking in a street that's unpleasant, they're actually starting out. And they saved. We were confident 15 or 20 years ago, the new urbanists were studying the future slums of the first ring suburbs, and we were saved by the immigrants. Remember when we say, oh, the immigrants are now bypassing the cities and going straight to the suburbs? Have you read that, what they were doing? Well, what they did, and it's very curious, they actually left the cities to the gentrifiers, but they actually moved into the suburbs and saved them, the first ring suburbs. In terms of Miami Beach and the fact that streets cross every 500 feet or less, it's very important to actually study the detail. And people like retailers like Bob Gibbs, these guys that succeed, the Taubmans and Simons, they manipulate the light. They manipulate the temperature. They continually adjust those elements at the center of the mall, all those things in there, those pavilions and plants and chairs that they have. Those are continually manipulated every 6 months to see how they affect the retail sales. They're continually monitoring because they know very well how finicky American humans are. And they also renovate every 10 years. Because they know how bad it is to have an out-of-date looking place. When something is out of date, it means you're not getting good value. And yet our main streets actually operate, restaurants that were once good are now dying. Why? Have you thought of renovating it? Have you thought of updating your menu? No, they don't. And so they die. So all this expert management is what really needs to be applied to the inner city. Even if you're going to keep the small mom and pop tenant, these need to be, there's nothing wrong with them, but they need to be managed. Do not assume they know what they're doing. By the way, one of the things I'd like to see, maybe tonight if I shut up, is the South Park episode called The City Part of Town. Okay, it is a satire of what we're talking about today. And it has people that look like me and talk like me saying the same thing. Okay? And it makes fun of all of us. And it's brutally frank. And one of the things that is most unexpected, by the way, it's all about the pursuit of a Whole Foods. In the town, okay, is there any way to sort of project it?
I'll tweet it.
Okay, let's tweet and project it because it's amazing and it's a great thing for the evening. Let's project it on here because it's priceless. But basically, the town decides that it has become completely uncool because it doesn't have a Whole Foods. So the whole thing is dedicated to the great badge of success, which is getting a Whole Foods. But one of the remarkable things is that they do succeed, and they do come up with the cool stores, and the cool people, as expectedly, move in. But you know what they're ruthless about? The absolute incompetence of the mom and pop shop owner. The mom and pop shop owner is sort of blown out of the water for sheer incompetence, and by the way, actually tries to redo itself, and they're still incompetent. And so it's ruthless about that. Like you also, if you're going to have your mom and pop survive, you have to give them first-rate advice. Second thing I wanted to talk about was another question that was asked of me, which was only lightly implied today, and it had to do with what we perceive to be the failure of democracy to actually come up with the right, or the difficulty of persuading democracy to arrive at what we consider the right solution. And many planners actually lose faith in democracy because we say, oh, we tried so hard and it was the wrong answer. The elected officials don't know what they're doing. The people come in their ignorance. This was catalyzed when I said that a person comes into a public hearing, confronts me, and the elected officials say, yes, Mr. Duany, what do you say about that? And instead of saying, and how many times and how many years has that person dedicated to their planning education, right, which is what I should say, yes, sir, and how many years have you dedicated to the study of cities? In fact, you say, yes, now let me try to explain again why you may or may not be right. There's an asymmetry that I referred to. I was in Perth, Australia, and I saw something that I'd never seen before. I saw a series of mansions on a cliff in a very beautiful beach, the richest people in Perth, and in front of it was a public clubhouse on the beach in front. And I said, how did you guys do that? In America, we could never get a public club. As you know, we barely get anybody to have access to the beaches when we have wealthy people in the front. And the lady who ran the planning department says, "Oh, you Americans, you don't know anything about democracy. You just incite the mob to come in. The way we do it is we realize that actually the people on the cliff are not democracy, they're a vested interest. And that the neighbor who comes in and says no to the school, or says no to whatever, or says yes to whatever, the neighbor, which we privilege the closest neighbor, the closest affected neighbor, and we raised so that the neighbor virtually has the whole say, without realizing that that neighbor or that group of neighbors, or small neighbors, is not a democracy. That's a vested interest. It's actually a single issue little mob that we incite because we notify the people within 1,000 feet of the issue. When what we should do is notify the city as a whole and actually separate the people who are immediately adjacent and show them for what they are, which are a vested interest. So what we do in Australia, she said there is a, or at least in Perth, he says there's an issue. Like, for example, let's locate a school. And we will propose a school where we think the school is best, the area that needs the school. We will notify the neighbors at 1,000 feet to come in, and we will use the jury pool rolls, or the election rolls, to bring in 600 people randomly selected. Random selection, okay, instead of specifically incited. A mob is a single purpose, is a dedicated purpose group. So the random selection is what democracy requires. Remember that a poll can be within 4 percentage points of a presidential election by actually polling only 700 people. We don't need to have 36 million people vote. We get the same answer with 700. What is it that they do that's so important? They maintain very rigorously a random sample. A random sample is what democracy requires. A tainted sample, a series of vested interests, such as is happening now in Congress, distorts democracy. So in Australia, they have 600 people come in, and they say, the issue is the location of this school. We would like 300 of you to volunteer to attend 3 charrette meetings and then 2 public hearings. And these are the dates. And so 300 people volunteer. And of those 300, about 150 show up. And by arriving at the meetings, they become conversant with the issues. In other words, they become experts. It's not the person that drags itself in and says, I just showed up, but I got an opinion. No. That person is disqualified by absence of showing up, because you have 150 expert people who then show up at the hearing. And at the hearing, the 150 people speak, representing the democracy as a whole, and the school board speaks, but we know that that's a vested interest, and the immediate neighbors speak, but we know they're a vested interest. And so, of course, they can speak as much as they like, but we do not confuse, or they do not confuse, the vested interest with the democracy. And it works marvelously. And one of the things that was said, if you're going to have a charrette, if you're going to include the public, you have got to actually, you can't just say, you'll come. Okay, that's not the way it's been set up. That's not the way the government has set up. That's not the way Constitution sets it up. And it's amazing that when the planning profession actually puts up with this, and of course we reap the problem of actually not running a proper democratic process. And until we do, it's going to be extremely expensive to run a public process. It's going to arrive at a very, very high order of wrong answers, and it's going to exhaust us and make us cynical. So it's something, by the way, I've spoken about this before, and there's been very little pickup. There seems to be energy to drag the process along in a kind of dumb way, and no energy to actually organize the process so that such a thing as the Perth process can go ahead. Any questions on that? By the way, the lady in the planning department has been on her job for 25 years, which shows you how effective it is when you do it right. Most planners can't stay on the job more than 10 years or 5 years because it's too tenuous. It goes wrong too often, or they shoot themselves.